Will the Senate please come to order? Senator from Chittenden.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank the body for waiting through the afternoon. Very productive afternoon, multiple caucuses, lots of drafting work, review of drafting work, and bringing people up to speed on what will be in some of the amendment that we'll be looking at. So my plan is to try our level best to complete work on H454. That will be the only work that we do tonight, other than messaging a few things we did this morning. So with that, Mr. President, I would ask that we move directly to H454 and the presentation of amendments. I believe the Senator from Addison has one to offer.
We have up for action H454, an act relating to transforming Vermont's education, governance, quality, and finance system. Please listen to the second reading of the bill.
H454, an act relating to transforming Vermont's education, governance, quality, and finance systems.
The question is now, shall the bill be read a third time? Senator from Addison.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I have what I believe is an amendment, technically, to the bill, which is, as you'll recall, is now the House version of the bill. So hopefully, do you all have it at this point? You do, okay. So I have a different version that has the highlights in it. So if I get the pages wrong, I'll try to tell you the sections. I have the highlighted version, but I don't have the other version. So I will try to tell you the sections as we go. You also should have, thank you very much. You also maybe should have a timeline that is, senators who've been working on this bill are very familiar with this timeline. I see the senator from Chittenden North. You are familiar with that timeline. It's the House timeline of the bill. Or hopefully people have it, and if the senator from Chittenden North could get a copy, that would be great. This is not exactly what's in this bill because we didn't have time to create a new timeline, but it's similar to what's in this bill. So I first want to start by thanking the senators, the chairs of the committees of jurisdiction, the senator from, the senior senator from Washington, chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and the senator from Bennington, the chair of the Education Committee, for all of the really, really hard work they and their committees did on this bill. And especially to the chair of the Senate Education Committee, who I've spent an enormous amount of time with in the last few days, talking through some very, very difficult issues in this bill and reaching a compromise, which is reflected in this draft of the bill. This is a long bill. Some of you know it quite well, and some of you don't know it very well at all. So I'm going to try to go through it with hopefully the right level of detail, but I am absolutely happy to answer questions at the end if I miss any of the details. So section 1 of the bill starts with the findings and intent. The findings were this is the findings and intent that were in the House version of the bill. And it walks through the history of how we've gotten here, starting with Act 60 and the Brigham decision in the late 1990s that really set into play our current funding system, our tax capacity funding system that really was a landmark change in the way that we funded our schools in order to create an equitable system regardless of where children live. That system has served the state very, very well for the last generation. But over the last almost 30 years since it went into place, a lot has changed. The number one thing that has changed is that we have seen a sharp decline in the number of students that we have in the state. We've lost over 25,000 students, I believe, since the Brigham decision. So we have had severe declining enrollments. And we've also had vast changes in the needs of our students and the diversity of our students across the state, as well as changes in our property values and our property valuation overall in the state. And so a lot of this has led to inequities in our current system that are making it so there are some districts in the state that are spending a significantly greater amount per pupil than other districts in the state. And so it's also making it so it's hard to control the cost of education. There are some very significant cost drivers that are fueling that. Part of it is the high cost of healthcare, but also the needs of students increasing, and also the fact that some districts are able and willing to spend more on their per pupil and others are not, and also our old facilities in our state that are in desperate need of upgrading. So this bill is really meant to address those inequities in our system, control the cost of our system, get a better handle on how the state is involved in the cost of the system, and to make it more equitable and effective based on student needs. So that's a lot of what happens, what is laid out in the findings of the bill in the beginning. And then starting halfway through section 1 is the intent or the plan. And this is the plan that's largely laid out in the House version of the bill that is consistent with this strike all amendment of the bill. That starts with the current year and what will happen. And this is what this lovely chart that shows the timeline of the House bill. This is reflected in the intent and plan section of the bill, and really is a stepwise system that a lot of things have to happen over the next several years in order to get to what's called the future state, where we have a more efficient, more equitable, and more sort of consistent system across the state. So that is laid out in the intent plan section of the bill. Senators, so section 2 is regarding the Commission on the Future of Public Education. Senators who were here last biennium will recall last session we created this commission and tasked it with doing a lot of things to come back to us with a plan. That commission did part of its work and not all of its work, and then the governor proposed what we all know was the basis for what this bill is and what I'm holding in my hand. The governor's proposed at the beginning of this session a major change in our school funding system and our school governance system. You'll recall that included a redistricting proposal to create 5 districts. It included implementation of a foundation formula. It included a lot of changes at the state level, at the Agency of Education level, at the State Board of Education level, and it included just a revamping of our state education system in general. So the Future of Public Education System Commission has changed duties in this. So you'll see a lot of strikeouts of what their duties were, but it does remain to do some important work for just the next few months, and then it goes out of existence at the end of 2025. We added in this version of the bill that it is to talk about how to maintain and improve community engagement and local decision-making with transitional and new school boards, and how to improve voter turnout for school elections throughout the creation and implementation of new school districts and a new school funding formula. A new school funding formula, a foundation formula, which I will explain later in the bill, is a formula that the state provides funding based on each individual student. It's not a system where voters vote on how much to spend on students. So a lot of us that are used to, Vermonters are used to voting on their school budgets, that won't be a thing anymore. And we want to make sure that local engagement in schools and local engagement in school decision-making stays an active part of the Vermont local culture. So the commission, which has a public engagement process that is starting right now in the last few months, they will be looking at how to maintain that kind of local decision-making and local engagement in schools over the next few months. They also will be engaged in an analysis of the impact of healthcare costs on the education fund. One of the cost drivers, as I mentioned, for our education funding is healthcare costs. We've talked about that a lot in this chamber, and the Health and Welfare Committee has done a number of bills to address those costs. But those are still a major cost driver for school budgets, and that is something that the commission will be working on over the next few months. But many of the duties, as you'll see in the bill, are repealed because the commission is no longer as necessary because of the work that was initiated by the governor at the beginning of this session and has been changed by the House and now the Senate with this bill. So you'll see in section 3, there's the creation of a school district redistricting task force. There's been a lot of conversation about the creation of new districts and how that's going to happen. As I said, the governor proposed 5 districts. There were a lot of proposals throughout this session, but what we really realized is that it's really difficult to create a new map of new school districts that meets all the needs and desires across the state. And so this is really something that we need an expert panel to do. So this would create a school district redistricting task force to recommend new school district boundaries and configurations to the General Assembly. It would be composed of the director of the Vermont Center for Geographic Information, or the state geographer, who knows how to make maps. It would also be composed of the chair of the Vermont School Boards Association, who would serve as the chair of this commission. They are school boards, and they would be making school districts that would be overseen by school boards, and so they have the expertise. Secretary of Education or designees, the chair of the Vermont Superintendents Association or designee, the chair of the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies. They're not usually involved in education policy, but they do a lot of planning at the regional level, and they do a lot of work on what is happening in regional sort of geographic boundaries. And so having them on here will be really helpful for that kind of perspective. Then 2 members appointed by the speaker, one of whom shall be a thank you very much. Thank you very much. A current member, I've been talking a lot. A current member of the House of Representatives, and then the other appointee from the speaker is somebody with expertise in education data analysis. 2 members appointed by the Committee on Committees, one who's a current senator and one who's an expert in GIS, or the Geographic Information Systems. The chair of the Commission on the Future of Public Education or designee, and then the director of the Vermont Association of School Business Officers. The business officers are the people who know how much schools cost. They're the ones that pay the bills, and so we wanted to have their expertise on this commission. And this section is really important. This task force would create 3 maps, at least 3 maps, 3 options for us to consider next session. And at least one of them has to have a boundary proposal that shall consider the use of supervisory unions and supervisory districts, allow for the continuation of a tuitioning system that provides continued access to independent schools that have served geographic areas that do not operate public schools for the grades served by the independent schools, and to the extent practical, not separate geographic areas that contain non-operating school districts as such districts exist on July 1st, 2025. There are members of the Senate, including the chair of the Senate Education Committee, who are very concerned about making sure that the historic academies and other schools that provide education to students through our public education system, through tuition to independent schools, would be able to be maintained in our system. So at least one of the maps has to be really sensitive to those boundaries and that system. The other two maps could include supervisory unions, could include these same considerations, but also could have different proposals and be more specific to just school districts or other types of considerations. The proposed new school districts shall not have an average daily membership of more than 8,000 PK through 12 students. So there's not a lower bound, but there is an upper bound, 8,000. We heard testimony that above that amount, districts can tend to get actually less efficient, especially over large rural areas. So this would put a cap on the large amount, but not the small. Nor would it have a cap on the number of districts. That would be up to the commission, this task force to consider. And then there's a list of considerations that they have to take into consideration, including grand lists and pupil count balance, demographically equitable, logistically feasible, and create the least amount of disruption to students as possible. We don't want to create districts that's really going to cause a lot of disruption to our communities and to our students. And the more equitable the districts are, the more equitable the funding system will be, and the less costly it will be to our system to have more uniform school districts. And the task force shall consider in all of these things current school district boundaries and town boundaries so that they don't break up towns, other regional services such as designated agencies that works with school districts, geographic barriers, including mountains and rivers. We have a lot of those in the state, population distribution, location capacity and facility condition scores, transportation and employment patterns, grand list values, student demographics, debt and liabilities, staffing levels, and any other factor the task force seems necessary. Their proposals have to include detailed maps that include the boundaries of the new district and then some other information about those new school districts. And they have to do all of this by November 1st of 2025. So it's a pretty big task. And that's why it's really important to have the expertise of these people involved in it, who know how to do this data analysis and then know how to create the maps necessary. And this would be then up to us next session to review those maps and make decisions about whether we wanted to accept one of those maps or make changes. For those of us who've been here for redistricting, it would not be unlike that, but hopefully this would provide a good groundwork to have the data and the information necessary to make those decisions next session. The creation of these school districts is the thing that everything else is contingent on. If there is not the creation of these new school districts, there would be no implementation of a new funding system. So if we don't act next session, or if the next legislature after that doesn't act to create school districts, the new foundation formula would not go into effect. That is a hard and fast contingency. The new foundation formula is not meant to be applied to our current school districts, and it creates a lot of the inequities that many of us have seen in those kind of scary printouts. Those kind of scary printouts are based on our current school districts. With new school districts, especially if they're more uniform school districts, the differences in tax rates and spending will be mitigated. So that's the construct of the new school districts. If we do create the new school districts, we need to have a transition. It is really hard to create new school districts. Those of us who worked on Act 46 at the local level, which I did, and several others in this room did in some capacity, there is a lot of things that happen when you transition from one set of school districts to another set of school districts. So this creates transition grants and transition school boards that would be made up of current school board members. And these transition boards would do the work to create the new school districts and all of the necessary things, including all the legal work, the consulting work, and they would create the local voting wards for these new districts. These are new municipalities that need to vote on a new school board, and these new districts would create these wards. So this would not be a legislative task. It would be left to the locals to figure out what are their local wards. And these transition boards would have grants in order to help them afford some of the things they need to do. They would also hire the new superintendent for the new districts and create the first budget for the new school districts. So this is really important to have a smooth transition from our current school districts to any future new school districts. And that is section 3A of the bill, for those of you who may be following along. Section 4 is just some intent language about the transformation of our education system that was in the House version of the bill. Section 5 is about educational quality standards, and this is the section that includes some school class size standards. One of the things that is both helpful and somewhat controversial, especially for our very small rural schools, is putting in some class size standards. But one of the things that drives the cost of education is having very, very, very small class sizes. To have a teacher teaching a class of only 4 kids is obviously not an efficient use of an educator, and it's costly on a per pupil basis to have 4 kids in a class with 1 teacher. So really the class size standards are one way of containing costs in our school districts. So this creates some class size standards. These are what I would call softer class size standards that have been, each iteration of the bill, the class size standards have been made softer. The governor had pretty high class size standards, and the House lowered them, and this lowers them again. So that the average class size minimum, and these are average minimums, that's important to know. For kindergarten, first grade would be 10 students. For grades 2 through 5 would be 12 students. 6 through 8 would be 15 students, and 9 through 12 would be 18 students. Excuse me. And one of the things and then there are some things that are exempted or excluded from those class size. Pre-kindergarten, so our pre-K students, the little kids, career and technical education, flexible pathways, terminal courses, which are courses that have like a terminal degree on them, I believe. Advanced placement courses and courses that require specialized equipment and driver's ed. So there are courses that are exempt where you really need to, you can only fit 3 kids in a car. You can't have more than that if for driver's ed, for example. So those would not be included in the average. And obviously we would still meet fire codes and all that stuff. And there are waivers for school boards if they really can't. They can apply for a waiver if they really can't. And then the state board action has also been softened. It's been changed so that it's over 3 consecutive years. So a school district doesn't meet these for 3 years, then there might be action taken. And then the secretary may do something, but she doesn't have to. So we changed the old shall to a may. So this is really just providing guidelines to school districts and then allowing for state action if it really gets to be a difficult problem in schools. Okay, so that is that section, and then there's a lot of current law information included in there. Section 7 is about State Board of Education rules and rulemaking. And this is asking the State Board of Education to update their rules on education quality standards and independent schools in order to comply with the things in this act. So it's just updates to rulemaking. Then section 8 is a section about the prohibition of school closure and transition to paying tuition. So this says that if there is a public school, it cannot be closed in order to tuition those kids to an independent private school. However, this was a section that the senator from Bennington and I spent quite a bit of time on, and we provided, there was some concern about parts of the state where it could be very geographically isolated, and maybe there isn't a public school anywhere near that a kid could go to if a public school had to close because it was so small or wasn't able to function anymore. In those geographically isolated sections, those students could be tuitioned to an independent school if there's one closer to where the school is that's being closed. If it's determined by the State Board of Education that it's a geographically isolated school. So that was a compromise section there. There's some statements of policy, and then we get to what's my favorite part of the bill, and this is the part of the bill about the school construction program. And why it's my favorite part of the bill is because it's been the least controversial part of the bill, and I want to thank, neither of them are in the chamber, but there were two senators on the school construction task force, a senator from Rutland and a senator from Chittenden Central. And they did some really, really great work on a state aid for school construction program and introduced bipartisan legislation in both houses. And that is what is in this bill, is that legislation. And it is the only section of the bill that has never been changed by any of the committees who've touched this bill. So that goes through a good section of the bill, but what it does is it creates a school construction program. It sets up their meeting structure for an advisory board of school construction. It sets up, a lot of, it establishes a school construction special fund, and I'll get into later about how that school construction special fund will get some money in it. And then it creates a process for approving school construction funding. For school construction and then facilities oversight. And this is a number of pages in the bill, and I'm happy to answer questions on it, but I'm not going to spend too much time going through the details, in large part because everybody likes it. One thing it does not do is provide the money to build schools. So it's really just creating the structure for this program and the fund for this program without actually creating the program, the funding for the program. And that will take us through, that takes us until section 15. And section 15 is just about an appeals section to the Agency of Education, saying that appeals can be in the Superior Court. I think this is just making it consistent with appeals to other state agencies that they're heard in the Superior Court. Kind of looking at my lawyer to see if that's true. And then there is transfer of rulemaking authority from the State Board of Education, and saying that the State Board of Education should make the rules instead of the Agency of Education about school construction. And then we get into section 18, and this is about tuition to approved independent schools. And this was also a section where there was a lot of attention and a lot of discussion. And where we ended up was a compromise in the middle, which is that tuition to independent schools would be limited, or tuition to schools would be limited to public schools located in Vermont and approved independent schools that are located in Vermont and approved under the laws of Vermont and located in a supervisory district that does not operate a public school, or a supervisory union with one or more member school districts that do not operate a public school. So in other words, in non-operating parts of school where there is not a public school, that those independent schools can receive tuition, and that those schools would have to have had 25% of the students in those schools enrolled that are funded by public funding and tuitioning as of 2023-2024 school year, so last year. So this is the two-part test that the Senate Education Committee came up with to provide tuition to some independent schools, but not all of them. And then therapeutic schools, which are schools that serve really high needs special education students, are exempt from this, so that for those people who are concerned about that, they're not included in this. And then there's a tuition transition provision. Hi up there. Hi, I see a little hand. This just provides transition for tuition over the next few years. Okay, so I'm going to go to the Agency of Education report, section 21. This asks the Agency of Education to report back to us on a bunch of different things. This did have a provision about statewide graduation requirements, though that was removed from the bill and that was in the House version. It's not in this. So this is information about a statewide financial data and student information system, recommendations about school construction, and progress regarding business processes. So lots of and directors and also the cooperation with therapeutic independent schools. So a lot of this is just reporting, getting information from the Agency of Education so that we can move forward with more decisions in the future. Okay, so now we're moving on to sections 22 is just a statement of intent about state level governance. And then section 23 is about the State Board of Education. And this would add 2 new members to the State Board of Education, one appointed by the Speaker, one appointed by the Committee on Committees. And then there's some provisions about transitioning those new State Board of Education members and potential removal of the members. The State Board of Education, they would serve with the other members who are appointed by the governor. So it is currently, I believe, an 10-person board that has 8 members plus 2 students, and this would add 2 more. No, it would just, yes, it would just replace 2 with legislative members. So section 27 is about tuition, and this is basically setting up the tuitioning system that we have in the state to be consistent with a foundation formula. And a foundation formula, the amount of funding that you get, that a student gets in a foundation formula, follows the student. So it's a base amount plus any weights, and I'll go into that, but that would follow the student, and so that would become the tuition amount. Because that is consistent with what public schools would get under a foundation formula. Section 29 is about special education delivery, and this is an extensive report on special education. We've been working for a number of years and passed major legislation, I think 8 years ago, Act 173, changing the way our special education was funded. That has not had the impact that we had hoped it would. So this is really more comprehensive report on special education funding and delivery in the state that is really will be really helpful as we move forward with a new foundation funding formula that would include special education weights. So that takes us through the next few sections of the bill. So we get to section 32, which is the Agency of Education appropriations. And this is largely the work of the Senate Appropriations Committee. There was one addition to it, which is $150,000 to hire an expert to do a comprehensive report on a foundation formula, and I'll get more into the details about that and later in the bill. There is a Scrivener's error in this section of the bill with that the Senate Chair of the Appropriations Committee and JFO and I have discussed, and I believe it will be corrected in the bill, just to make sure the math adds up, because I don't want to report a bill where the math doesn't work. So the chair of the Appropriations Committee and the secretary will be taking care of that Scrivener's error, which I think is just changing one number in this. So it all adds up to $4 million. And there's also positions that are provided through the pooled positions to the Agency of Education in order to do a lot of the work that's in this bill. Then the next several sections are the sections where we start to talk about the foundation formula. So the foundation formula that is in this bill is a cost factor, empirically based foundation formula, which means that it is based on the current cost of our education system with our current school districts and our current construct of how things work right now in Vermont. It was developed by a nationally renowned expert on school finance, who is the author of the pupil weighting study, who was worked on several years ago for senators who've been here for a little while. And a foundation formula is really what it sounds like. There's a base amount, which is the foundation, and on top of it are weights that provide additional resources for different types of students. And they are all added on top of each other. They're additive weights. So the base amount in this formula is $15,033, and you can see that in section 16 of paragraph 16 of section 34 of the bill. That is the base amount, and everything is built on top of that. And the weights are proportional to the base. So if you have, as I just explained in caucus to some members of the Senate, if you have a base of 15,000 and you have a weight of 0.1 or 10%, then you would get an additional amount of 1,500 on top of that base amount. So it would be 15,000 plus 1,500. So you would get 16,500. So then you build on top of that. So just to explain the way that a foundation formula works. And the weights that would be provided in this education funding formula would include tiered weights for both special education, and they are based on the cost categories for special education. Some types of disabilities are more costly to educate than others. And so this wouldn't be based on what type of disability you have, but what the cost to educate a student in a certain disability category. And it would be a 3-tier disability category. It also provides tiered weights for English language learning based on the level of proficiency for English language learning. And also an additional weight for students who are called newcomer students or SLIFE. And these are students who not only need English language learning education, but they also have come from a situation where they have not had the sort of basic information. They may have been in a refugee camp and never really gone to school. So they need additional services. So there would be a weight for that as well. And these are laid out in this section of the bill. And you can see the levels for what the Agency of Education would have to report and school districts would have to report to the agency in order to get their weighted amounts. And then the weights themselves come later in that section. And you can see there's a weight for poverty, which is any student who is below 185% of the federal poverty level would have a weight of 1.02, and then the different ELL weights, and then you can see the other weights for special education as well. The additional thing that this would provide is weights for, and you'll see this in section 37, for small schools and schools in sparse areas of the state. We have these weights in our current system. We also have the ELL weights and poverty weights in our current system. And one thing that this version of the bill does is correct an error that was in the House version of the bill about how sparsity is calculated. This is based on a school, in a sparse area and not a sparse school district. So it's a school in a sparse area. And right now it's calculated based on the zip code, but I'll get back to that because there's a report back on whether zip code is the best use. And then there's also a small school grant for schools that have fewer than 100 pupils. Both the sparse schools and the small schools will be provided as a grant, not a weight. So an actual dollar amount, not a weight amount. And so there would be more flexibility on whether or not to give those grants as things change with the school as they go above 100 students, for example. And they would be for small schools that are considered small by necessity. And there is a requirement that the State Board of Education defines small by necessity. So there are a lot of provisions in the next parts of the bill that are just updating our statutes in order to accommodate this new funding formula. And so I'm going to, and then there are a lot of things that are updating the tax rates, the homestead and non-homestead tax rates for the changes that are made in the bill based on the tax classifications, which I'll get into a little bit more in the later parts of the bill. There is this construct, and I'm realizing I didn't talk about this in caucus just now, but in supplemental spending, so that there is an allowance for supplemental spending, and this is spending above the foundation amount. And this would require a school vote. So voters would have to vote on whether or not they want to spend above the base amount of foundation amount in their school district. And they would be allowed to spend no more than 10% of their total enrollment times the base funding amount. So 10% of, if they have 100 kids times, or 1,000 kids times $15,000. So that 10% of that, then they would have to vote on that. And the way that this is equalized, so that this part would be equalized based on the grand list value of the school district. And every school district that decides to spend above the base would have to be equalized to the grand list value of the lowest value school district in the state. So if you have a very high value school district, they would actually end up raising more money than they need because they would be pegged to the lowest value district, and but they would only be able to keep that 10%. The extra would go into that fund that was created for school district construction, for school facility construction that I mentioned earlier. So that's how, if school districts decide to spend above the base amount, that's how the extra money would go into this special fund for school district construction. And it's based on this supplemental tax that is calculated in section 43 of the bill. I'm sorry, I'm not doing a good job with telling you the sections. So there are a number of reports included, and these show up in various parts of the bill. So there's a report on transportation. There would still be a categorical aid for transportation provided to school districts. That would not be part of the foundation formula. There is also a report back about kindergarten funding or pre-kindergarten funding, and a report back from JFO about what kind of inflationary measures to use. What's embedded in the bill is the NEPA, which is the National Income Product Accounts inflator and deflator. And that is maybe not the right thing to use, but it is commonly used, and we are asking for a report to say, is this the best thing to use? Let us know. Okay, then section 45A, this was added in this version of the bill over the last few days. It is a foundation formula report back that I've mentioned that would hire a contractor with expertise in Vermont's education funding system to develop a cost factor foundation formula for Vermont's education system that includes tiered weights for CTE. One of the concerns that we talked about extensively in the Senate Finance Committee was, what about career and technical education? How will that be funded? This would create ask for a tiered weight for CTE. Not all CTE programs cost the same. Aerodynamics or airplanes are more expensive than design and illustration, for example. So, and then there are some part-time, some in-house, some out-of-house. There are lots of different ways of delivering CTE education. So this would be a full analysis of the cost of that and an associated weight, also updated weights for English language learners and special education, and any other weights that are determined to be necessary and empirically based for an adequate and equitable education. It also would ask for us a recommendation on whether to use zip code to determine sparsity, or if there's a better way of determining sparsity given how funky zip codes are in our state. The report would also include a detailed explanation of the analysis of the work done to arrive at the recommended weights, and whether it costs more to educate a secondary student than an elementary student in Vermont. There was a lot of concern and a lot of discussion about what happened to the high school weight. There is in our current funding formula an additional weight for high school students and an additional weight for middle school students. The most recent analysis that was done does not include those weights because with updated data, it was determined that those weights were no longer necessary. But there has been a lot of concern about that. So this asks explicitly to address that and whether or not those costs are indeed more expensive for secondary students and whether a weight should be necessary. And then also to explain the methodology. And this would be a comprehensive report, very similar to our pupil weighting report. And this would be submitted by December 1st of 2026, so a year and a half from now. And this report would be required to be received and the legislature given the opportunity to act on that report prior to any new foundation formula going into effect. So the next legislature would be able to update the weights if they so choose and create a different foundation formula based on the new information in this report. And there's $150,000 appropriated to the Joint Fiscal Office to manage this contract. And this is why there was a Scribner's error in the Appropriations Committee because we added this 150 and didn't account for it, but that will be taken care of. So the next provision is about the transition for these educational opportunity payments, which are the base amount plus the weights. They're called educational opportunity payments. This is so that school districts are not really jolted with a lot more money or a lot of less money. And this was the construct that was actually developed by our Senate Education Committee, and it rolls in this this new funding amount over a 4-year period, and it is developed based on a transition gap amount from the 28 school year to the FY 28 school year to the FY 30 school year. And so that's what you see in section 45B. Later in the bill, there's a similar construct that your Senate Finance Committee created that would roll in the tax rates for these new districts as well. So there's not a jolt up or down for tax rates, but those are also rolled in over a 4-year timeline. There is the next several sections, section 46, 45C and 46, and just update things, updating definitions and getting rid of the statutes for our old funding formula. And paragraph 18 in section 46 has the definitions, 18 and 19, the definitions of the recapture amount. Recapture is the amount that is recaptured for spending above the foundation formula. If you're a high value district, you're generating more funds by doing that, and that's called the recapture amount, which we set the yield to in order to raise a sufficient amount based on the local decisions about spending. That would change in the new system. The spending would be what the foundation amount is that the state provides for school districts, and there would be a uniform tax rate across the state, a uniform homestead tax rate for residential properties, and a uniform non-homestead tax rate for non-residential properties. So that's what these sections are laying out, is the tax calculations. And then there is the section about how the supplemental district spending tax is imposed. There would be, for that tax, it would be more like the current system with a yield that would be based on the grand list value of the lowest spending district. So that's what this next section lays out. Then these next several sections are all about updating the tax statutes in order to put in the new system versus the old system. So you see a lot of crossed out stuff for that. Section 48A is the transition for the tax rate that I mentioned. Then a bunch of conforming revisions for the statewide property tax rates and tax levies. And then we are going to get to the homestead property tax exemption. So this is where we have income sensitivity for lower income Vermonters to help them pay their property taxes. Right now, what we have is a property tax credit system, and that property tax credit is applied the year after our property tax bills. So you get your property tax bill this year, and if you qualify for the credit, you get the credit next year. So it's a delay, and it's really difficult to both administer and also to manage because the credit doesn't match the bill. So this would do everything in the same year, and there would be a property tax exemption, meaning that part of the house site value would be exempt from the property tax, and it would be ramped up based on a person's income. The lowest income people would get a 99% exemption on their house site value of up to $425,000 of their house site. And as that ramps up, the percentage, as your income ramps up, the percentage of the exemption ramps down. So as you have more income, there's a lower percentage. And you can see this on, it's in section, it's in section 6066, which I know is a different type of section, but in section 6066, there's a lot of crossing out of our current property tax credit and then this property tax exemption. So you can see the ramping up for, for 25,000 to 39,999, you would get 90% exempt, and it goes up. And this is based on the first 425,000 of your income, of your house site value. And then as you get to 50,000 and above, it is based on the first $400,000 of your house site value. And this goes up to an income of $100,000 where you would receive 5% exempt from your property tax. The Senate Finance, this is the contract that the Senate Finance Committee came up with. We did a ton of work in that committee looking at a lot of different options, and this is where we landed. This costs the same amount as our current system, which our current property tax credit system. So we were trying to not spend more money, but also trying to find a solution that provided income sensitivity while doing it in the same year. And that's what this is in here. And we also ask later in the bill for a report back from the tax department about whether or not they have recommendations to how to maybe do this better. We kind of ran out of time to do a lot of machinations of it. And so we wanted to put something in the bill so that there was something there. This spends less money than the House's version, but we also didn't want to just leave it out altogether. We also asked them for recommendations on an inflator that's based on house site value. Okay, so then there are a bunch of sections that are just conforming, updating the language about homestead taxes and non-homestead taxes. And then we're going to, then section 53A is about that report that I just mentioned. And some conforming stuff about property tax credit repeals. And then there's an update to this committee on the advisory committee on the education fund. This is section 57. It's adding to some of the things that they do, asking them for national best practices on intra-district school effects of foundation formulas, transition from cost-based foundation formula to an evidence-based foundation formula, and methods for ensuring that school districts spend their educational opportunity payments on the costs that underlie the foundation. This is just information on the foundation formula and really overseeing the school education fund. And then this section 59 is maybe confusing because this looks like it's a different foundation formula. And one thing that's really important to say is that this is a placeholder numbers for a future foundation formula in the future state. That if we get to the future state, we may be able to implement a different kind of foundation formula, which is called an evidence-based foundation formula. And if we reach that future state and check all those boxes, we could transition to an evidence-based foundation formula that is really based on a national model of what is the most appropriate amount of money to spend based on a school district of this size and classes of this size and this type of inputs that we want for our schools. That was the foundation formula that the governor proposed. So this is a future state foundation formula. These are placeholder amounts. It would only go into effect in the future state with a bunch of things happening first. The next section, section 61, is a property tax classification study and implementation proposal. The House version of the bill included new property tax classifications for non-homestead properties. Thank you. And so we right now have homestead and non-homestead properties. The House version of the bill included two new non-homestead properties classes, one for non-residential or second homes, and one for apartments or rentals. The Senate Finance Committee took those changes in the property tax classifications out and instead asked for a report back on whether or not we should move to them, and if we do, what's their recommendation to how to move to them, because it's a major tax change. So that is as proposed by your Senate Finance Committee. We are almost done, people. We are almost done. The next section is about regional assessment districts, section 62. Regional assessment districts would create countywide, or 12 of them. The two smaller counties, Grand Isle and Essex County, would be combined with the counties next to them. So there would be 12 regional assessment districts to do property reappraisals. And for those of you, my friends on the Government Operations Committee from last biennium, we did a bill, Act 68, that asked for a report back from the tax department on how to create or what to do about our property reappraisal system, because many of our towns are way behind in reappraising their property. And this creates a backlog. They're having a hard time getting appraisers. They're having a hard time keeping up their grand lists and making sure that they are updated. And this actually has an impact on our education system and the property tax rates for our education system and the really funky common levels of appraisal, so that it's making property taxes across the state really out of whack. That's a technical term. And so this would create regional assessment districts that would reappraise property in different regions of the state on a schedule, on a 6-year schedule. This was recommended by the tax department. This is something that has not been controversial for the most part, and this would set it into place, but it would also create, of course, a task force or stakeholder group to help the tax department evaluate how to implement this and make sure that they're considering all of the ways to transition. This is the last thing on the future state. If you look at this, January 1st, 2030 is when the reappraisal districts would go into effect. And the reason it's important to have in this bill and to really do in effect is that municipalities have contracts right now with reappraisers, and we need to set this in statute in enough in advance so they can take into consideration those contracts for their reappraisers. Okay, and the rest of the bill, is miscellaneous tax provisions that were requested by the Department of Taxes, and there was not a miscellaneous tax bill, so they were put in this bill. They are mostly updating things about there is a thing about tax sales. That there won't be tax sales for anything less than $1,500. This also came out of a committee that the Government Operations Committee worked on. It was the one thing that committee could agree on, so we put it in this bill. And then there is a change in the payment that is paid to the people who are hearing officers for property tax valuation appeals. And they get paid almost nothing to do this really, really important work. So this would increase their pay to $38 an hour. And then everything else is technical. And then the last section of the bill, section 70, is the effective dates. And there are like 5 pages of effective dates. And most of that is reflected in this lovely chart that was produced by our dear legislative counsel attorney, John Gray. So that's what those effective dates, and I can answer any questions about them, but I'm not going to go through them all now. And that, Mr. President, is the bill. They're strange. I don't know what to say about the vote because it was never really voted on. Or the witnesses, although both the Committee on Finance and the Committee on Education heard from dozens and dozens and dozens of witnesses throughout their work. I guess I just want to end by really, really sincerely thanking our staff who over the last few days have done person's work. We are so fortunate to have the attorneys and fiscal analysts that we have working in this building, and literally they have not had sleep this week, and I am incredibly grateful to each and every one of them, to Kirby, to John, to Beth, to Julia, to Ezra. I couldn't see who was back there. To the staff of both the fiscal office, Chris, and the legislative council. They have been amazing. So I'm going to end with that. Thank you, Mr. President, and I welcome your questions.
The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? That's not what my script says, though. Okay, right here. let's rephrase the question. The question is, shall the Senate propose to the House to amend the bill as offered by the Senator from Addison and others? Are you ready for the question? If so, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Nay. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion carries. Now the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for the question? Senator from Chittenden.
I actually have a couple of amendments I would like to offer. I'll start with one. They are being passed out, and I don't know which one's coming, so I don't want to start talking until I know which amendment we're doing. Perfect. So this is going to seem very familiar to many in the body. This is a simple data collection amendment that I included in my proposed amendment to the yield bill. This would require that all people report their income on their homestead property tax declarations. This would allow us to have the information that we need to potentially raise or change the threshold for income sensitivity. Currently, under our current system, it's $115,000 of household income. I believe under this proposal of change, it's $100,000. What I know to be true in 2025 is that's actually not an adequate, $100,000 of household income is really not adequate to pay the daily bills. And so I think it's time that we update that income sensitivity. But we can't do that without the data to do so. So what this would simply require going forward is that so all people are required to file a homestead declaration, but they are only required to report their income if they're applying for income sensitivity. And this would require that income be reported with all homestead declarations, which would then give us the data to adjust the income sensitivity guidelines in accordance with 2025 cost of living expenses. And that is all. I would ask for the Senate's support.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Included in this bill is a study for the tax department to look at what kind of data we need to further define and put ourselves really in a position to know if we can tax other kinds of property, other income. We haven't talked about this specific amendment, but my concern would be that some people, Vermonters are very private people, might decide not to file a homestead exemption. There is no reason to file it if you're not going to get, a rebate of any kind. And so people might just not file it. I would rather we wait until we know what information we have, we know what the tax department needs, and then when we make the decision that we make it all as one package.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from Rutland.
Thank you, Mr. President. If I may interrogate the presenter of the amendment.
The presenter of the amendment is interrogated.
I'm no tax specialist. I just am curious if household incomes are already reported, if that information is already available in annual income tax filings.
I appreciate the question, and I asked the same question when I was drafting the yield bill amendment, and what I was told by our fiscal analysis is that the income tax world and the homestead declaration world don't communicate with one another, and the household income as it's defined for the homestead declaration is different than the income as defined by our income taxes. So it is not available in our current filing of income taxes.
I thank the Senator from Chittenden, and thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Chittenden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will agree with the Chair of Finance on this. I do think it would be better to take it all together, and so I will be a no on this amendment. Thank you.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from Chittenden.
Mr. President, may I interrogate the presenter of the amendment?
The presenter is interrogated.
Mr. President, as I understand it, when a renter, for example, is asked to provide their household income for the purposes of a renter rebate, they need to include the income of everyone in the household, regardless of who is paying rent, and they need to ensure that they're adding up all of that household income. I am having trouble understanding when we speak of the homestead owner's household income, if that is including all members of the household, regardless of whether or not they compensate that homestead owner a portion of their income.
I am not sure I fully understand the question. Is what the senator is asking is if, say, a renter was living in someone's home that they owned and paying them, whether or not that would be part of their income?
Mr. President, that would be one scenario. Another scenario might be someone who is living in the household and has income, but is not paying toward the homestead owner's actual income. So what's hard for me to understand how it would be calculated here is you might be connecting this to the homestead owner's tax filing, which usually includes a spouse, for example, if they're filing jointly. But if they have a relative living in the home who files separately, as I understand this, they would need to include that household income, even though it is not income that is specific to the homestead owner.
Thank you for the clarification, as I've only ever been eligible to file for renters rebates because I'm not a homeowner. I'm going to have to ask for a brief recess to defer to legislative counsel to understand the difference.
Take a brief recess. Will the Senate please come to order?
Thank you, Mr. President. So to answer the senator's question, this is not changing current law. This is already the definition of how household income data is defined for current income. Household income sensitivity and the household definition is already in law. We're not changing that at all. It's what we ask anyone applying for income sensitivity to report. It's simply expanding, asking the others who are required to file a homestead declaration but may not be required to report their income because they're not applying for income sensitivity to also apply or provide that so that we can use that data to I would say expand income sensitivity, but this is not changing current law for that definition at all.
I thank the senator. Mr. President, having served on the Finance Committee and echoing the sentiments of the senior senator from Washington, small changes to a tax form still add up to a lot of confusion and need to transition our systems. And we don't take it lightly to change an entire tax form that people are used to unless we are clear on all of the changes that we might want and how to make sure they're clearly explained to those preparing or filling out those tax forms. So while I know I and many others am sympathetic to the effort to receive data, I will not be able to vote for the amendment because this is something that needs to be more carefully considered as part of other changes.
Are you ready for the question? The question is, shall the Senate proposal of amendment be amended as offered by the senator from Chittenden Central, Senator Vihovsky, Are you ready for the question? If so, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Nay. Motion fails. Are there any further amendments? Senator from Chittenden Central.
Thank you. I have one other amendment that I'm going to be offering today, and it is to add a study. I know we love those, to this bill. I think it's really critically important that that senators understand that when we compare per pupil spending in Vermont to per pupil spending in other states, we're actually not comparing apples to apples. Vermont includes many things in our education fund that no other state does. The largest of which is our mental health and social support services. These are critical services that our students need to succeed in the classroom, but every other state funds this through the general fund, not the ed fund. And so while you will hear people say that we have one of the highest per pupil spending rates in the country, and on its face the statement is true, it's not truly representative of what we are funding. And so what this asks us to do, and I do believe that former President Pro Tem Tim Ash asked for a similar study in 2017, and I know I had included a very similar study in a bill that I introduced when I was in the House in 2021. What it asks us to do is quantify as a separate line item what we are spending on human services and social services within our education fund, so that when we compare what we're spending on education to other states, we can actually look at what we're funding the same as other states and what we're funding in addition to what other states fund. I think it's challenging when we have this one number and we look at it and we say, oh, that's bigger than all the other states, but we don't actually know what goes into that number, because we, as I said, do fund many things in our education fund that other states don't. And so what this challenges us to do is actually separate those out, so that when we're comparing per pupil education spending in Vermont to other states, we have the ability to compare apples to apples. We may at some later point decide that maybe we should fund some of those other things in some other way. That gives me great pause, which is why this doesn't suggest we do that, but simply that we quantify what Vermont education funds are funding that are similar to other states and what we're funding that other states don't. I would actually be deeply concerned if we were talking about actually pulling those out of the education fund. As I've seen time and time again, working in human services, often in lean budget years, human services are the first things we underfund. And so I actually support potentially keeping this in our ed fund, but I do think we should quantify what it is, and that's what this proposes we do.
Senator from Chittenden.
Mr. President, I'm not sure I have a question here. I may. First, if we're looking at the annual cost of providing health care and social services to students It's my understanding that many schools have line items with counselors who support students. Other schools have grants. Other schools have contracts with designated agencies and other folks who come in and support students. I guess my question is, perhaps of the chair of education, please, could we?
Senator, are you requesting to interrogate
Yes,
someone?
yeah, the chair of education, if I
The
might.
the chair of education is interrogated if he so chooses.
What I'm trying to sort out is the complexity of providing the information that's asked for in this amendment. It's a very laudable amendment, of course, we'd like to know that, and we know about school nurses, but some schools have full-time nurses and some have no nurses, and sometimes some have full-time, part-time, full-time. So if I might, Mr. President, ask how efficiently how would one go about accessing the costs that are embedded in this proposal?
Mr. President, I'm not sure I know how to answer that question, although I am I'm sympathetic to the intent of this amendment. It's something I'd love for the committee to take up, which we've seen it at some point, because the presenter is, I think, although I can't quantify it, right about a lot of what she is saying, what the senator is saying. And I'd love to look at it, but I think it is actually complex, although I actually agree it's information that we would love to have. In fact, we put it in the bill, the Senate Ed bill had something to this effect for the commission to have this. One of the things that it looks, actually for the Commission on the Future of Education, had to be one of the things added to its list of tasks. But beyond that, I'm not sure how to answer the question.
Thank you. So my comment would be, it sounds like it's something we'd like to know about. It sounds like a exceedingly difficult task to add into a complex bill at this point. So I will not support it, even though I support the intent at this time. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. We've been working on this bill 4 weeks. The other body worked on it 4 months. This agreement has been tightly crafted and heavily worked over the last few days. And if this request had been brought to us when we were writing the bill, we could have put it in. At this point, my concern is that we have talked about the highest, we have the highest cost in the country per student. But that's not the issue we're really dealing with here. And I'm going to I never got to do my speech on the history and why we're here. But really why we're here is we started out supporting our schools on the taxing capacity, the property taxing capacity of individual towns. And it got so individual towns, some of them couldn't do it on their own. And so the state came up with a foundation formula and said, if you can't do the minimum, we'll help you do the minimum. And other towns could tax what they wanted. We reached the point where the other towns could afford violin orchestras in their middle school, and some of the other towns without property wealth couldn't afford a music teacher, and we got the Brigham decision, at which point we went from town to a statewide property tax. And we said, okay, we're going to take the property wealth of the state, and we're going to tax that to support our system. We have reached the point, I think, we knew it when we did Act 46, where the cost of our education system is exceeding the ability of our property wealth to pay for it. And so what this bill is not looking at is the cost per student. It's looking at the structure and how do we restructure so that we can afford an education system and make sure that every child gets the education they need at a price their parents and grandparents can afford to pay. And we will, as we go through that, work on that cost per student. But at this point, I am concerned. I don't know how many studies showed up in this final bill. There's a lot of studies, and there's going to be a committee of conference, and there may be more versions of the bill. And to ask our staff at this point to do more studies, I have concerns about. And if that question is there next year, I'll be happy to take it into committee and, get it into an appropriate bill. But I think at this point and at this stage of the game, it really isn't the time to do it.
Are you ready for the question? The question is, shall the Senate proposal of amendment be amended as offered by the senator from Chittenden Central? Are you ready for the question? If so, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. No. The nays have it, and the amendment has failed. Are there any further amendments? Senator from Caledonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have two. I just want to see if I can understand which one's going on first. Okay, short one. Thank you, Mr. President. There's two pieces of paper going around. One is the bill, and the other is some quick analysis done by JFO. For those of you that were in this building or tuned in during Act 46, Act 46 had a mechanism called allowable growth rates. And the intent of allowable growth rates in that time was we were going to try to control the increase in district spending while we constructed a new funding formula. The new funding formula never came, as you might remember. And so what I am proposing that we do again is in this interim period between FY, the fiscal year we're in right now, and fiscal year 29, that we put some measures in place to control the growth in district spending during FY 27 and 28 so that our taxpayers can afford the taxes to stay in their homes, and also so that the general fund can retain monies that they need to that are important to the people of the state of Vermont, instead of sending even larger amounts over to the education fund. I believe last year the general fund sent over 23 million. This year it was 77 million. And I think when we look at the rate of pace and growth of spending and what inflation is, it'll probably grow by another 50 million in FY 27 and then probably another 50 million in FY 28 unless trajectories change. And so what this amendment would do is it would force a slowdown in the growth of district spending. It is a rather, well, I wouldn't say it's a simple calculation, but as you are probably noticing, I think there was the handout that has all of what each district's allowable growth rate would be in the first year based off of FY 26. Is what happens is you take the quotient of the highest spending district on a long-term weighted ADM basis and the lowest spending district. So you divide the big number by the bottom number, which gives you a number close to 2. That's about the disparity between our low spending districts and our high spending districts is about double, which is my opinion, not Brigham compliant. It subtracts 1 from that quotient and then multiplies it by 5.5. And as you'll see, unlike Act 46, I did put a minimum here in that any district would get at least a minimum of 1%, even if the calculation provided less than 1%. And as you see, as you look through here, you're probably scanning your districts, I'm sure. The lowest that any district will receive is 1%, and I believe the highest that any district spends receives is 5.4%. And they would be able to grow their long-term weighted ADM spending by that amount in FY27 and they could spend more. We don't want to tell any districts how much they want to spend, but what would effectively happen is for spending that exceeds that growth rate, then that district would be assessed the excess spending penalty. Okay, so the current excess spending threshold and penalty would go on pause, and going forward, we would just assess growth, and if the district's growth exceeded the growth rate that they were assigned on only the amount over, they would receive the excess spending penalty, and they would pay double for those dollars only. So what this is that it is an attempt to slow down the spending across the state to a level that doesn't hurt our kids, but also allows our taxpayers to survive. I have not had an opportunity to present this to the Senate Finance Committee. The timing this week has been a little difficult. Didn't even know what bill I was amending it to until, I guess, 3 o'clock. And they have probably not taken enough testimony on this subject, although it has been discussed. But I throw it out here because I think we need to be serious about the interim between now and whenever our next funding formula is, because our taxpayers are under a tremendous amount of stress. And I do remember the last time we went through this and we were going to do all of this, and it was only temporary because we were going to have a new funding formula in a couple of years that was going to solve this whole problem. But we never got a new funding formula. And with this iteration of the bill, if we don't get a map that we approve of, we don't have a new formula. So I kind of see things could be setting up for a similar situation going forward. So not having had the time to present this to the committee and not having the time to have them do the analysis, I will be withdrawing this amendment at this time without objection, but I do hope to have a conversation about real cost containment in our system going forward. Thank you.
Without objection, we will withdraw the amendment. Are there any further amendments? Senator from Caledonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Second amendment, which is going out, and all I have is 2. Trying to get home as well. This is I think a 25-page amendment, but it boils down to really 5 simple things that I hope the body will consider. I think that by now, Mr. President, that we've all heard about this, I guess I'll call it a problem, or maybe something to solve in the underlying bill that we're looking at here. And it is the phenomena where if you are a low spending district and you're frugal, and you may even be getting good results, that district, if we move to a foundation formula as it is envisioned in this bill, will get hit with a tax rate increase. In some cases, as much as 25 or 30%. And I don't think that I want to tell any of my districts that are low spenders that we're going to fix this problem by moving to a foundation that they're going to get a tax rate increase. I don't feel a lot of love for that idea out in Vermont. And so what this bill does is it allows any school district to take less than 100% of their equal opportunity payment, down to a minimum of 85%. Okay? If they chose to do that, they don't have to, many won't, but if they chose to do that, they would receive a light percentage decrease in their property tax rate. So as an example, Mr. President, if Danville said, we want to spend 90% of the EOP, we think we can give our kids a good, high-quality education for that amount, 90% of their base and weights. If they made that decision, if their voters made that decision, then Danville's tax rate would be 90% of the statewide tax rate. They would have some control over that. In the case where a district is a sending district, Mr. President, in other words, they don't operate for some grades. A lot of our districts they operate grades pre-K through 8, and then they tuition 9 through 12. In that situation, if the district decided to spend less than 100%, then the receiving school would receive the same percent from the district. So I guess Danville was a bad example because Danville's not a sending district. But if Danville was a sending district and they were sending kids to a receiving school, the receiving school would also receive 90% of the EOP. There's only one exception here, and that would be for the districts that are completely non-operating. They don't operate any public schools. They would not have the ability to ask for less than 85%. They would have to be at 100% of the EOP because they don't operate, and so there would be no reason for them not to do 85, okay? So that's on the, that's what happens below 100%. On the high side, for those that are trying to come into this thing from, I guess what we call our high spending districts right now, they, instead of 10%, which is what's in the underlying bill right now, Mr. President, it would be 15%. So in perpetuity, districts would be able to spend as much as 15% more above the EOP or 85% of the EOP, which would be a range of 30%. As I said earlier in my remarks on allowable growth rates, our spread right now is about 100%. So this would be a dramatic improvement over 100%. Also, because we're allowing these big ramps on either side of 100% to these districts, where they can control how fast they come in or whether they get to 100%, it also makes the transition mechanisms, both spending and tax rate transitions that are in the underlying bill, it really makes them unnecessary. They're not necessary any longer. Each district is able to control its own transition. And the last change that's in this amendment, Mr. President, is a change to how the supplemental yield would be determined. In the underlying bill, the supplemental yield, which is the for the people that are spending more than 100%, the yield is based off the lowest spending districts, or not the lowest spending district, the district with the lowest grand list to ADM ratio, okay? It sets a yield based on that. So in theory, that lowest spending district, if they have supplemental spending, they will raise as much money as they need. But everybody above that is gonna raise more money than what they take. And even in a world, like a VSBA region world, which I think was 11 school districts, the top district, which I think was Wyndham, that down in the southeast corner, they were gonna collect twice as much money as they would actually receive if they were involved in supplemental spending. And if we used our existing districts, it's like 15 to 1. And I don't think that any district that has to spend more than 100% to provide their kids with a good education should get set up like that. And so what this yield change does is it uses the same yield mechanism, but it bases it to the mean district's grand list EDM instead of the bottom. And that way you have some will do a little better and some will do a little worse, but you won't have this dramatic impact where you're spending 2 times or more for that supplemental spending that you are receiving. Okay? So that is the extent of the bill, Mr. President. Just trying to create some bigger, better, more compassionate on-ramps for districts that are going to have to deal with this funding formula and trying to make things a little bit simpler and give the districts some control instead of keeping all the control right here. Thank you.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's now about 6 o'clock on Friday night, and I could ask that we take about an hour to recess so that the Finance Committee could go over this 25-page bill. I think some of these issues we have talked about in finance, Some, we had different versions in our bill, but I think I can say all of them are premature. We are not proposing to make any changes at this time. We won't know any of these numbers until the districts are set. And then, if we need to, we can make changes. We now equalize so that the poorer, financially or, and our issue now is towns that are economically poor, that can't afford to pay for the extra cent to raise what they're spending. We can make these changes. We, have not talked anything about pulling an income lever in this bill. In fact, this envisions decreasing because we have always, since Act 60, charged non-homestead at a slightly higher rate than homestead. This bill, as it stands now, is equal. We're giving up legislation or income to move forward, and we're anticipating perhaps having some other revenue-raising opportunities. We could use that to equalize if towns I think none of us are going to ask any of our towns to raise their tax rate 30%, even if we do it over 5 or 6 years. I think we know as we go through this, we are going to have to find ways to equalize things. These are several we did talk about, and again, this was the panic with the spreadsheet. My town has to spend $17,000, $2,000 less a student. I'm going to have to, hatchet everything, or my tax rate's going up 30%. We aren't there yet, but we're all in that mindset of my little school. If we go through with this, there won't be your little school. Your little school may exist, but it will be in a larger district. Once we get that mapped, then we can start doing the calculations. Then we can start making the decisions around some of these things. To do it now is premature. We did talk about letting some towns pay 20% less and 20% more because we don't want to ask our schools to make those cuts or those tax increases. And we were told by council that the minute, and we have said there is a base rate you're supposed to be spending, the minute we say, okay, this is what it costs to provide an education, but you can spend, a 30% differential here, you raise a red flag for Brigham. No one knows how the courts would decide, but once you say in law, you can spend less or you can spend more, and that comes out to being on your property wealth usually, or your income wealth of your voters to be able to afford that extra penny. And so I would suggest we will talk about these. I don't think it would be particularly constructive to do it tonight. They will get talked about as this entire process moves forward. And I think my committee is definitely aware of the issues. We're aware that there are going to be problems we need to solve, but we don't need to solve them tonight in order for this process to go forward.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from Essex.
Thank you, Mr. President. Unfortunately, there's a lot of complex numbers in this bill, but there are some of my towns, every one of my towns will get a tax increase. They're the most rural area of the state and poorest area of the state, and some are as high as 30% based on what we have for these numbers, with the quick estimations that we have. So I think it's important that we do talk about it now. We're talking about passing the biggest transformation of education since we started closing down one-room schoolhouses. We're looking at a bill right here that has very little scrutiny. In fact, hardly any committee work at all. And I think that at some point in time, we absolutely positively should talk about the hard choices that we're ready to make as we move forward. I would ask, Mr. President, that on this amendment, when it's vote is called for, that it's taken by roll. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator has requested when the vote is taken, it shall be by roll. Senator from Chittenden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the comments from my colleague. I would just point out one thing. As you remember, we reverted to the House bill. That bill did have massive amounts of testimony, massive amounts of work. Then it came over to us, and yes, we did some work on it here in the last few days, but the House's work is always diligent. They always take great amounts of testimony, and I trust them in that way. So I just wanted to just take exception to that one piece. This bill has lots of testimony, lots of process. The amendments, I think it's a fair critique that they have not had the committee process, and that's why I believe we're voting them down. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Addison.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just echo both what the pro tem said and what the chair of finance said. Not only did this bill have a lot of testimony in the House, but the entire finance section of this bill is largely what the Senate Finance Committee passed and took a lot of extensive testimony on. So that part of the bill remains largely the same. And even in the Senate Education Committee sections, there are many elements that the Senate Education Committee did, and those took a lot of testimony as well. And I appreciate the senator from Caledonia's amendment, but to echo what the chair of Finance Committee said is that first of all, this would make the foundation formula less equitable and less constitutionally sound. To allow districts right off the bat to spend less or spend more on the foundation formula, because a foundation formula, unlike our current system, it is very different than our current system. It says at the state level, this is what the state determines is the empirically derived base amount that should be spent per pupil. And if we automatically allow districts to spend less or more, that is getting into some constitutional issues, and that is concerning. And in terms of the recapture amount, or the amount that you peg the spending, the supplemental spending to, that too, pegging it to the median makes it less equitable and also raises constitutional concerns about the supplemental spending. So while I appreciate the sentiment of this, one of the ways that we have tried to address the ramping in and ramping out of the tax rate and the spending amounts is through that 4-year phase-in, one of which was devised by our Senate Education Committee and one of which was devised by our Senate Finance Committee. And both committees took a lot of testimony on how to ramp in and out of the new foundation formula and new tax rates, which, by the way, would not start until FY29. So that leaves a lot of time to have further discussions, as the chair of finance said. So I encourage senators to vote no on this amendment. Thank you.
Senator from Chittenden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to say a few things. I really appreciate the Senator from Caledonia putting forward these notions. There's merit in really looking at what these contemplate. I have concerns with the percentage approach, not necessarily from a constitutional perspective, but I think the real answer is to determine an educational opportunity payment that is really what it takes to deliver a quality public education that isn't necessarily based on what our current spending is. That would be something lower, and I think that would mitigate a lot of the concerns from the senator from Orleans.
Essex.
My bad, my bad. Southeast, nobody ever knows it. So no, I appreciate that, Mr. President. I just don't think the percentage approach is the right way, whereas the real solution is how you calculate that foundation amount. And that's what I appreciate in this new amendment, what we passed earlier on today. So I don't plan to vote for this because of that, but I do hope that the conversation continues about what that foundation amount is, because I'm seriously concerned with the approach that we're taking. It's not a foundation, it's the whole house, and that's where a lot of this falls apart for me as I think about how this would be implemented statewide. The second part I also greatly appreciate, and there was a lot of committee discussion on this with a whole bunch of graphs, color-coded things. What I would say is this approach would take in less money. It would collect less taxes. I do think it needs to be reconsidered once the school districts are evaluated. The current recapture approach from the House will generate more money for school construction. And we've had Let's Build Homes. I want to Let's Build Schools. So I am not necessarily against the recapture rate. That will generate more resources to build schools. But I do think when the school districts get configured, this really should be considered and part of the discussion, because if you're in that district, that just because your grand list or pupil ratio is a lot higher than others, should you really bear that burden more so? And so what the senator from Caledonia has put forward, I would say would be a much more fair approach towards having us all, relative to the grand list and pupils in our districts, pay proportionally into that fund. I'd also say that with the approach outlined in this, we'd effectively be taking a really large foundation formula in our current system and smacking it on top, creating two pools of funding. And so that might be an approach worth considering as this conversation continues. I appreciate putting it forward. I don't plan to vote in support of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Lamoille.
Mr. President, I will be supporting this, and I want to give you an example. Two communities, Morrisville and Morristown and Elmore. That district, Morrisville being the much larger community, Morrisville spends 13% below the state average, and their test scores are significantly above the state average. So this is not a question for a community like Morristown of not producing a good education for their kids. They've done that. Their spending is lower. And going through this whole process, not knowing what the districts will look like, not knowing what there is in the future and how we will put this together, there's a lot of angst in that community about the fact that they have done the right thing. They're producing good education for their students, and they're doing it at a lesser cost. And for me, and I think for all of us, we shouldn't give them a feeling that we're not listening to the fact that they're doing the right thing. And this amendment strikes at them having done the right thing, and that somebody is listening and is paying attention to the fact that some low spending towns are doing the right thing. And I think that's something we should reward.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have discussed that there are some schools that spend less and produce well. There are some schools that spend a lot and don't produce particularly well. I haven't been able to get the names from the Department of Education. I've seen a graph with different colored circles, but no names. But we have discussed that, and we have discussed how do you deal with those schools. We do hear them. We do want to do that. But this is not the time to do that. I think we are all in our current think. We are all thinking about this little school and this little school. And I'm just looking at the tall senator from Rutland, and the image of the Navy came to me. We have this boat and this big boat and this little boat. And if you just look at each one of them, you don't see the fleet that we are imagining for the future. And I've got schools that are looking at a 30% tax rate, increase. And I've got schools that are looking at having to cut $2,000 to $3,000 a student. And all I can tell you is, don't go there yet. Wait till we get the districts aligned. Wait till we get the numbers we have now, I'm told, will work if we go to the governor's, what's he got, 5 districts, because the property wealth gets leveled out over those districts. Part of our job is going to be saying, okay, but how do you deal with a district that big? And if you make it smaller, how do what does that do to the cost per student? Our joint fiscal office is going to have an awful lot of work to do for us before we get to the end. And when we get to the end, if there's something to panic about, that will be the time to panic. We know the issues we're looking at. We know that the problem now is a penny on the tax rate costs the same in every town, but some towns can afford that penny with more ease than others because some towns are financially wealthier than other towns. We know we have to deal with that issue, but tonight is not the time to deal with it because we don't have the foundational information to make the right decision.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from Essex.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sorry to stand for a second time, but if tonight's not the night, Mr. President, all we're asking for, we're more than likely, the Democrats and progressives in this chamber are going to pass a bill again that I feel that hasn't had much of a proper viewing, and I know there's a difference of opinion on that, and I appreciate the comments of the pro tem about that. All we're asking for, Mr. President, is to, as the Senator Lamoille has said, is to give these towns a chance to be heard and to be listened to. This bill is going to more than likely go to a conference committee. We're just asking to add a simple little amendment in there to have our rural districts who are doing a great job, spending less, be listened to. And if this isn't agreed to in the committee of conference, well, then they can take it out. We haven't asked for anything in this bill, nothing whatsoever. Our input has been very minimal, and in fact, very asked about very minimal. We're going to be getting voted on. It probably, obviously, we're standing here, or we didn't pass this bill yesterday because the votes weren't there. So chances are it's going to pass today. So we're just asking for a little bit of an amendment to put in there, and if the committee of conference decides at the end of the day that it isn't time, then they will fix that and they will adjust that. But to let our towns that are spending less and doing a great job be heard, we're asking for you to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from Chittenden.
Mr. President, may I interrogate the presenter of the amendment?
The presenter of the amendment is interrogated.
Mr. President, the senator in his introduction of the amendment alluded to the cost-saving measures that a district may have undergone, but also indicated that maybe they also have good outcomes. Can the senator point to where in this amendment it is contemplated that your tax break would be predicated on equitable, average, or good outcomes for the students in your district?
No, that's not part of this amendment. I'm perfectly willing to let local communities to decide what is what amount of money is necessary to provide an adequate or an excellent education for their children. And I don't provide a scenario where they can go below 85%, nor do I provide a scenario where they can go above 115%. I keep them in that range. I don't believe the underlying bill has any requirement to prove any type of educational quality, whether they're between 100 and 110%. That's not contemplated in the underlying bill either.
Mr. President, I thank the senator. I hope that some of the last words that we speak on the floor about this bill, I'm sorry, I thought I did say thank you to the senator. I hope that some of the last words that we speak about this bill before we send it to the other chamber are really about kids. We're talking about, we want to save taxpayers' money, and maybe we'll still have good outcomes for our kids. Maybe some communities are showing the way, and in fact, many of us study those communities and want to learn from them how they are achieving high outcomes for their kids with less dollars per pupil, lower property wealth in their community, higher poverty in their community. That usually boils down to incredibly dedicated teachers and principals in those schools. And it's something we can learn from, and it doesn't always just cost money to do that, but it is a student-centered and focused approach. And I want to remind us that the foundation formula that we are passing in this bill is not simply made up out of nowhere. It is not simply taking the average amount of dollars that a school district spends on each type of student with different types of needs and working backwards from there. It is landing us at a place where we can expect solid outcomes, good test scores, and a solid proficiency-based education for our kids for the most efficient cost. The second you start to deviate from that, you start to break this most sacred contract that we try to make as a society to give our kids, our future, the resources that they need to be successful. And so what has concerned me in the decade plus that I've been in the legislature and we've had these debates is we always end talking about taxpayers, but all Vermonters want a strong and viable and excellent education for our kids. And being on the education committee after spending so long on Ways and Means and Finance has shown me that $16,000, $17,000 per student is a deal. It's a deal. I mean, we are asking our educators to do the most for a relatively low cost per student, given all that our schools do for our kids, given everything you've heard in this debate and in this session about what our schools do for our kids. And so there's some figures that have been circulating lately that I think we should really be highlighting for our communities and our districts. And they essentially have to do with the fact that over the last decade, largely centering on the pandemic, the cost of housing and healthcare has gone up over 400%. And the cost of education has gone up in that same time frame about 90%. So as we are ending this debate, let it be said that we thank our teachers, we thank our educators, we thank our principals, our superintendents, everyone who works in our schools, everyone who takes care of our kids, because they have been doing more with less. They continue to do more with less. And what we are seeing from some of our colleagues is this same tired idea that it's all our public education system's fault, that we don't have enough money in our pockets and our kids aren't doing the absolute 100% best. That is extremely unfair. And it's even more unfair when an amendment like this is put forward that asks them to do even more with less and doesn't even contemplate having equitable outcomes. Thank you, Mr. President.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from Orange.
Mr. President, just to let the body know, I've got 329 emails from my constituents in my community in Orange County
every one of them opposing H454 because it's going to take control away from their local schools. One teacher in particular reached out to me and used the book by George Orwell, 1984, and Big Brother watching over them and taking control of everything. And that's what they're concerned about with H454, taking control out of their own local school districts, taking it out of their local schools. They're worried about losing their schools. They're worried about the ratios that are in this bill about classroom sizes. They're worried about everything. I'm not talking just teachers. We're talking superintendents reaching out to me as well. And I have to go out with empathy constantly with these guys.
Point of information, Mr. President. Are we still debating the amendments from the senator from Caledonia or the underlying bill?
We are still debating the amendment from the senator from Caledonia.
Yeah. And I
would ask the senator to focus on the
the
amendment.
amendment. I
not the whole
stand
bill.
in favor of the amendment, and I stand in opposition of H54 for my constituents, where we need to have empathy for our constituents. Everybody here does, whether you're from Burlington or whether you're from Corinth or Bradford. We need to have empathy. We need to have it from the Northeast Kingdom. We need to have empathy for our constituents. We've got to look at the people in our community and vote for them, not for ourselves and our own ideology. Thank you, Mr. President.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from Orleans.
Oh, Mr. President, I wasn't going to speak, but Essex spoke, and Lamoille spoke, and Caledonia spoke, and we're like animal crackers who come in a box. I'll give you a second. I'm hearing a lot of equivocating back and forth on whether or not there's been enough time on the Senator from Caledonia's amendment, whether there's been enough committee time. We've been handed an 80-page amendment that we voted through, and I didn't hear much squawking about committee time or any discussion about that. And Mr. President, we can equivocate, we can go back and forth, but while we sit here and fiddle, my constituents sell their homes. So thank you, Mr. President.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from, let's see, where's that senator? Grand Isle.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking of Grand Isle, I have towns on both sides of the spectrum. I have low spending towns in the islands, high spending towns in the islands, low spending town in Colchester. So I'm caught between. I think this amendment I support. It seems to me a very simple amendment. I know it hasn't been looked at, and it is 20-something pages long, but it helps the folks in the island by choice if they choose. It doesn't force anybody to do anything, but it gives them the option to provide a better education, more money per student, should they vote on it. And then on the other end of the spectrum in Colchester, it allows for those folks to accept 90 or 85% in this amendment, less than they would normally receive, keep their taxes down. Being a low spending district like we are in Colchester, our taxes will most likely rise. So I think this amendment helps both of my communities, my whole district, and I fully support it. Thank you.
Are you ready for the question? If so, the question is, shall the Senate proposal of amendment be amended as offered by the senator from Caledonia? The secretary shall call the roll.
Senator Brew.
No.
Senator Peck.
Yes.
Senator Baumgart. No. Senator Brillen.
Yes.
Senator Brock. Yes. Senator Chittenden.
No.
Senator Clarkson.
No.
Senator Collmore.
Yes.
Senator Cummings.
No.
Senator Douglas.
Yes.
Senator Dooley.
No.
Senator Hardy.
No.
Senator Harrison.
No.
Senator Hart.
Yes.
Senator Hashim.
No.
Senator Heffernan.
Yeah.
Senator Ingalls.
Yes.
Senator Lyons.
No.
Senator Major,
No.
Senator Matos,
Yes.
Senator Norris,
Yes.
Senator Purcell,
No.
Senator Plunkett,
No.
Senator Ron Hinsdale,
No.
Senator Bohosky,
No.
Senator Watson,
No.
Senator Weeks,
Yes.
Senator Westman,
Yes.
Senator White,
No.
Senator Williams,
Yes.
The yeas 13 and the nays 17, the motion has failed. The question now is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for the question? If so, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and you've ordered third reading of H 454. Senator from Chittenden.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the body for that discussion. I have discussed with several folks moving this to all stages of passage tonight. And so I will, at this time, ask that our rules be suspended and that H 454 be put through all remaining stages of passage.
Senator from Chittenden has moved that the Senate rules be suspended, put H 454 through all remaining stages of passage. Are you ready for the question? If so, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay.
Nay.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and motion carries. We have H 454 for third reading. Are there any amendments prior to third reading? Please listen to the third reading.
H 454, an act relating to transforming Vermont's education governance, quality, and finance systems.
The question is, shall the bill pass in concurrence with the proposal of amendment? Are you ready for that question? If so, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Too late. Ken. Senator from Caledonia.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you, everybody, for this process. I realize what we're voting on is just sending something. It's to send something to the House that's probably going to end up in conference. And I hope that when that work occurs, that we'll continue to work on this bill, make it better. I think the governor's position will come in and I think, fine tune the rough edges, consider the kids, but also consider the taxpayers. And I thank everybody for the work.
Are you ready for the question? If so, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. And I don't have that on the script. We put that was the pass. And you passed H 454. 54. I had that part right. Senator from Chittenden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm not sure if senators are aware, but as we debated this over the last few days, I was told this in the cafeteria. Okay. House members came up to me and said, we were watching you on YouTube with popcorn. And we were must-see TV. And I will say that we have given Vermonters and our colleagues in the House a bit of a show over the last couple of days. But what we have really shown is that you underestimate the Vermont Senate at your peril. We took up from the governor a huge challenge at the beginning of this session. And that was relieve property taxpayers on this year's property tax, which we have done. So we have bought that down to a near flat rate. It is dearly bought, but we bought it down. And that was to respect the taxpayers that we have just heard about from our Republican colleagues. We did that work together. But the other piece, as the governor put it, was that we needed a bridge to a new system in order to justify that level of investment. And we have begun that work with this bill. I would be remiss if I didn't thank profusely certain people. So I want to talk about our chairs of jurisdiction. I want to talk about the senator from Addison, Senator Hardy, who did yeoman's work on this bill. Also, I wanted to thank Senator Gewley, my district mate, who had a journey to get to yes on this bill. In addition, we've already thanked JFO and Ledge Council, our hardworking people, but I just want to say I am proud of my caucus for its unanimity. And I'm proud of my Republican colleagues who, as we worked on this, continued to talk with me about the path forward. So I have appreciated everyone's collegiality, and at the end of the day, the solutions and the hard work we have offered our constituents. So with that said, Mr. President, I always forget the most important person, Ashley Moore, who helped us connect all together on all of these issues every day, all of the time. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, Ashley. With that said, Mr. President, I would ask that the rules be suspended and that our work on H454 be messaged to the House forthwith.
The senator from Chittenden has moved that the Senate rules be suspended and that we message our actions on H454 to the House forthwith. Are you ready for the question? All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The motion carries. Senator from Chittenden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple of more articles to message to the House from our earlier work today. So a quick informational question for the Secretary. Can I wrap these into one motion? Thank you. With that said, I would move that our rules be suspended and that our actions taken on H91, an act relating to the Vermont Homeless Emergency Assistance and Responsive Transition to Housing Program, H472, an act relating to professions and occupations regulated by the Office of Professional Regulation, be messaged to the House forthwith.
Senator from Chittenden has moved that we suspend the Senate rules in order to message to the House forthwith our actions on H91 and H472. Are you ready for the question? If so, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Ayes have it, and the motion carries. Senator from Chittenden.
With that, Mr. President, our work tonight is done, and unless people have further announcements, we will be able to go home and enjoy a weekend. So with that said, pending further announcements, I would move that the Senate stand in adjournment until 10 a.m. Tuesday, May 27th.
Are there any announcements? Senator from Addison.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask for a moment of personal privilege.
You may.
I stand before you not to make a political statement, but to honor the men and women who have made the ultimate sacrifice serving our nation. As I reflect on my 33 years of service in the United States Air Force, I have witnessed firsthand the dedication and courage of those who have given their lives so that we can enjoy our freedoms that we hold dear. The pain, the heartache their families endure in this profounding knowing their loved ones will never come home, never again share a moment together. Those who serve our armed forces live by a core value of service before self, a value that transcends political affiliations. Disagreements with the commander-in-chief is their unwavering belief in freedom and duty that carries them forward. This Memorial Day, I ask each of you to pause just for a moment and remember those who gave everything so we can live freely, speak openly, and pursue our dreams. Before we adjourn, I respectfully ask that we say the Pledge of Allegiance together to respect those that have fallen. Can we do that? If that is okay
Would everyone kindly stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance in honor of our fallen military folks? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President?
Please
If I
wait
may.
to be recognized.
If I might, Mr. President, I'd like to withdraw my motion and ask that the remarks of the senator from Addison be journalized.
The senator from Chittenden has moved that we journalize the remarks of the senator from Addison. Are you ready for the question? Senator from Addison.
Thank you, Mr. President. The pro tem beat me to it, but I also just would like to thank my colleague and my district mate for his service to our country. Thank you.
Are you ready for the question? Senator from Orange.
Yes, Mr. President. I would like the Senate to take a moment and reflect on Representative Michael Selsworth and his loss that he had with his son in Afghanistan. And he and I have many conversations, and this is a tough weekend for him. So with empathy, please reflect on Mr. Selsworth. Thank you.
Are you ready for the question? If so, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and we've journalized the remarks of the senator from Addison. Senator from Chittenden.
With that, Mr. President, I'll repeat my motion. Pending further announcements, I would move that the Senate stand in adjournment until 10 a.m. Tuesday, May 27th.
Are you ready for the question? The question is, shall the Senate stand in adjournment until 10 a.m. Tuesday, May 27th? If so, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the Senate will stand in adjournment until 10 a.m. Tuesday, May 27th.